Order, order. Thank you for joining us today. It's our first session looking at child food poverty, which has been prompted by a petition started by Marcus Rashford, which calls on the government to end child food poverty by implementing 3 recommendations of the National Food Strategy. The first being to expand free school meals to all under 16s where a parent or guardian is in receipt of universal credit or equivalent benefit, provide meals and activities during all holidays, increase the value of Healthy Start vouchers to at least £4.25 a week, and expand the scheme. And it's an issue which is of huge public interest, particularly during the COVID-19 outbreak, which has been demonstrated by the 1.1 million people who have signed Marcus's petition. So earlier this week, I spoke to Marcus about his petition and his work on this issue. And for those that are interested, there's a video of our discussion available on our website. And he's made some hugely compelling arguments about the need for action on this issue. So we're holding this session today to explore some of the issues around child food poverty, the government's approach to the issue, and how to best support families during and beyond COVID-19 so that all children receive fair access to food. So I want to give a very warm welcome to our panel today who have joined us, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your views and input on this. So my first question to our panel: you all work for organisations that have direct contact with children and families experiencing food insecurity. So could you please just start by introducing yourselves and telling us about your roles? Shall I start with you, Lindsay Boswell, who is the Chief Executive of FareShare?
My name's Lindsay Boswell. I run a national food redistribution charity called FareShare. Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today. FareShare in normal times exclusively deals in surplus food, and so tackling an environmental issue to be able to drive social value. We do that by supplying food to frontline community groups that we believe are amongst some of the real experts to be able to identify and to connect with those people who are most vulnerable in society. We operate across the 4 nations of the UK. We operate at some considerable scale, so we currently support 11,000 frontline charity community groups, 62% of whom are supporting children and families. And we average at the moment during the whole of 2020 and into 2021, around about 2.2 million meals worth of food redistributed to those organisations every single week.
Gosh, right.
I think it's worth pointing out that food is not the solution to poverty, but using food as a way of connecting people to those within their local communities that can address the causes that sit behind somebody's vulnerability or their problems is a phenomenal community asset, and is definitely a contributing factor, not just 365 across the year, but in particular during the various holiday breaks, which is why the call on support for holiday programs is such a fundamental part, and we support many of those programs.
Okay, thank you. That was a very, very comprehensive response. I'm sure there's a lot to go into on what you've said there. Can I go next to you, Garry Lemon, Director of Policy, External Affairs and Research at the Trussell Trust?
That's right. Thank you for having us here, and thank you to everybody who signed the petition so that we could have this discussion. Yes, so I'm representing the Trussell Trust, and I represent a network of over 1,200 food bank centres right across the UK. Our strategic vision as an organisation is to end the need for food banks in the UK. We don't think it's right that anybody should need emergency food in order to get by. And just to give an idea of scale of need, just in the last full year alone, we distributed 1.9 million emergency food parcels to households and families in financial crisis.
Thank you. And Azmina, I'll come to you next. Azmina Siddique, Policy and Research Manager at the Children's Society.
Thank you, and I'll echo everyone else's thanks as well for having us here today to give evidence on this really important topic. My name is Azmina. I'm here from the Children's Society. We are a national children's society, a charity as our name would suggest, and we work across the country to try and help young people and their families suffering not just from food poverty, but abuse, neglect, exploitation. We have a very wide range of support and services. And our mission really, and which has been for 140 years now, is to work towards a society that's built for all children. And I would say that one of the things I'd be interested in speaking about a bit further today is specifically families who are from low-income migrant backgrounds who are affected by the no recourse to public funds condition. They're families that we work with really closely at the Children's Society, and we know that they've been particularly affected by some of the issues that we'll be discussing today.
Thank you. And last but not least, I'll come to you, Anna. Anna Taylor, Executive Director of the Food Foundation.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. The Food Foundation, I head up the team at the Food Foundation, and we're a charity that works to ensure our food system supports everybody to eat well, regardless of their income. We've been working on this issue of children's food poverty for a couple of years. We did an inquiry that was published last year, in fact, for a cross-party parliamentary group, really investigating the challenges around children's food insecurity. And so we don't work directly with people that are affected, but we have got a panel of 22 young food ambassadors who have themselves lived experience of children's food poverty, and who we work very closely with and give us a huge amount of insight as to the situation on the ground. And since COVID struck, we've done 7 surveys at a national level to understand people's experiences around food insecurity, so who've been quite involved in trying to inform the national response and make sure it reaches those that need it. Thanks.
Well, the question I was going to ask next, and maybe Anna, you, given what you've just said, you could come in first here, is what do you see day to day through your work in terms of the scale of food poverty in England and how it affects families?
Well, the very latest data that we've got, which was from a survey we conducted in September, showed that 14% of households with children were experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity. That amounts, if you extrapolate it up, to about 4 million people, including about 2.3 million children. And that relates to the previous 6 months. So really the period that COVID has been, we've experienced the pandemic. And that's higher than previously. So before the crisis, it was about 2 to 3 percentage points lower than that. So it's gone up. And that, we know that the situation was very, very bad in the first phase of lockdown, but got better as that 6 month period progressed. And we also, I mean, what we mean when we say moderate and severe food insecurity, there are sort of 3 questions we ask people. So it's, have you had to skip meals because of lack of money or not being able to access the food you need? Have you gone hungry and not eaten because for those same reasons? Or have you gone for a whole day without eating for those same reasons? So, and that's a standard way of finding out about food insecurity. It's used in lots of different countries. It's used by the Food Standards Agency. So it's a sort of standardized approach. That gives you an idea around the scale of the problem. And we know that within households with children, ethnic minority households, households where there has been someone shielding or with underlying health conditions, and then households where there's a disability, somebody with a disability, are even worse affected. That's a really, really significant risk factor for households experiencing food insecurity.
Gosh. Would the other witnesses like to come in and answer the same question? Have you got something to add? Garry.
Yeah, I think it's important when talking about need to also define the term food poverty. So important to remember that food poverty is just one symptom of a wider structural issue, which is simply put, poverty. We know this because we survey people referred to Trussell Trust food banks, and the majority of households referred to us meet the definition of destitution. So it isn't just food that they can't afford. It's heating, it's lighting, it's clothing, it's toiletries. So as Lindsay said at the beginning, ultimately food isn't the answer here. To get to the point of scale of need, it's also really important to understand that these issues didn't just start with the pandemic, they've been growing for many years now. So we've had years of stagnant wages, frozen cap working age benefits, which include universal credit. Last year, we kind of up to the start of the pandemic, as I said, distributed 1.9 million emergency food parcels. And that wasn't with a significant increase in the number of Trussell Trust food banks. And then when COVID hit, we saw a really sharp and instant increase in need. So just for the first 6 months of this financial year, April to September, 1.2 million parcels, which is 47% higher than the last year, so a record need for our services. And families with children have been particularly hard hit. 470,000 of those food parcels went to children. That is 2,600 food parcels to children a day just from Trussell Trust food banks. A really big increase in need from new people as well who've never needed a food bank as well. So just in the first few weeks of the pandemic, 100,000 new people who'd never used a food bank before had to be referred to us to get emergency food packages because they're in financial crisis.
And have you got anything that you want to add, Lindsay, to that?
Chair, when it comes to empirical data, we very much look to the Food Foundation and Anna's amazing organisation for that core data, but the anecdotal information that we're getting from many of those 11,000 organisations back to us is that there is a subtlety of the situation here that, and this is pandemic specific rather than broader than the pandemic, and I completely agree with Garry about this is a problem that existed pre-March of last year, and that subtlety is that they are finding a disproportionate number of the people who are turning to them for support and help are from families where the breadwinners have been in low employment, insecure jobs, quite often linked to the hospitality sector, and were managing to make ends meet beforehand, but are now finding that because of the fragile employment market at that end of the spectrum, falling outside of furlough schemes and such, that is where the disproportionate increase in numbers of families who have been turning for support have come from.
So people who have lost their employment or just seen their income significantly reduced.
Yes, or possibly lost some of their employment because actually their employment was a portfolio of multiple jobs. And then the other contributing factor is if they've lost the support mechanisms that enable their children to be looked after whilst they do those jobs, then they've had to stay at home. That's more of a comment, I think, principally aimed at the first lockdown. Yeah.
And Azmina, have you got something that you want to add, or there'll be plenty of opportunity to come in if everything's been covered already?
I'll just add one small point. I very much agree with the point that this has to be seen in the broader context of sort of poverty more generally. Just two small things. One is that we surveyed some parents in September when most schools had gone back to see how they were coping with the cost of their child's school food during the day. And the thing that surprised us really was most of the parents we spoke to weren't on free school meal support. There were many families who'd never really had any sort of contact with the social security system before, but 1 in 7 of those parents said that they had struggled to cover the cost of their child's food during the school day. So this is, these are by no means new issues, but for many families it's the first time that this struggle has really hit them. And I would like to echo the comment that Anna mentioned about particularly families from BAME backgrounds struggling. Again, we've seen through our services, we support a lot of families who have the no recourse to public funds condition attached on their leave to remain. Many, actually disproportionate amounts of these families are BAME, and they have been among the hardest hit. And to echo what Lindsay, you were saying, there have been so many income shocks, job losses, but these families also have no other safety net on which to turn. So the situation for many of them, was dire before the pandemic. Many families are often stuck in cycles of destitution if they have an LPF, but it's been made a lot worse. And we really are seeing this affecting the children within these families who are, actually often British. They were certainly born here, know no other home, but they've been locked out and they're feeling the impacts of this more than ever before.
Thank you. So, I mean, we know this isn't a new issue, and that you've mentioned that it's this COVID pandemic that really has thrown what's been an existing problem both into relief, and it's created and multiplied the situation for many families. So, why do you think it is that Marcus Rashford's campaign has captured the public imagination in such a big way? It's open to any of you.
If I may, I think it's a combination of a couple of things. I think that the messaging has come from a very, very unusual location. A young man who's a footballer, aged 22 at the time that he started this. I think the authenticity of his story. Obviously, his celebrity has enabled him to have the story heard in the first place, but I think his authenticity alongside that. And I think then combined with the circumstances of the pandemic, where the majority or a larger proportion of society realize that this is tough on themselves, but there are always people who are harder pressed than they are, and therefore compassion and sympathy and understanding, as we've had to stop our busy lives, has increased and accelerated. And I think coming up with a coherent, comprehensive response to this could be one of the fantastic outcomes that comes out of this dreadful situation.
Anna, Garry, did you want to come in there? And then I'll bring you in, Anna, because I've got another question for you that I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I think Lindsay's absolutely right. He's the right person with the right message at the right time. The only thing I would add is that, as well as the British public, I think, showing the absolute best of themselves in terms of wanting to look after each other, wanting to protect the NHS, and to the million people who signed this petition because they cared so deeply about it. There's evidence of a wider shift in public opinion about issues around poverty. So the National Centre for Social Research, for example, I believe just a couple of days ago, for the first time found that since 2001, found the public were as likely to say benefits are too low as to say they are too high. So it does look like it isn't just around Marcus Rashford. There is a wider public desire for structural change, I think, here.
And Anna, if you want to come in and say something on that, but I also wanted to ask you about the asks in Marcus's petition, because they echo calls from the Food Foundation's Children Future Fund inquiry in 2019, and other reviews by other organisations as well. But so in terms of timing and why Marcus has made such an impact, but also how seriously do you think the government were taking the issue before Marcus's intervention?
So just a quick build on the previous point before I move on to that, and that's that I think the other incredibly powerful thing about Marcus's personal story is that he sort of demonstrated through that how vitally important it is that we actually listen to people who've got direct experience of these circumstances and don't have it translated through the likes of me or others. And I think he also, by virtue of the fact that he was willing to tell his story, he gave permission, if you like, to others to tell theirs, and for that to not feel like it was a shameful experience for them, which we have to remember that very many people who are in this circumstance feel ashamed to talk about it, and we have to address that problem if we're going to really solve it, because it's only really by understanding people's circumstances that we can come up with the right mix of solutions. In terms of whether we launched the Children's Future Food Inquiry in April 2019. At that time, we had a very good ongoing conversation with Minister Nadeem Zahawi, who was at that time in the Minister for Families and Children in the Department for Education. And we had a very good, a very constructive conversation about the sorts of measures which needed to be put in place. And DFE indeed wrote to schools about several aspects of the inquiry. So the conversation began really well, but then because of we had then the sort of no deal Brexit, we had the election, there was a whole series of things which made it very difficult to progress the issue at the time. I think the problem that we've experienced though through the pandemic is the fact that there isn't actually really a home in government to understand what's going on in terms of food insecurity on the ground, gather the data so that it can really inform government policy across the different departments that need to act. I think that remains a problem today. There were some measures put in place in the heat of the pandemic, the Food Vulnerability Task Force, which one of the ministers chaired, that did a really important job here in terms of bringing together intelligence, but there's no ongoing function. And I think that's a real weakness in terms of being able to actually get a proper government response in place.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, to the other witnesses, what change have you seen in the government's interest in these issues since Marcus started his campaign? Have you noticed any? Azmina?
Well, I'd say that one of the very positive sort of outcomes has been around the extension of free school meals to children affected by NRPF. And actually one of the sort of broader calls that I know has been backed by Marcus Rashford has been around extending that sort of eligibility question around free school meals. This is, I shouldn't be giving credit because it hasn't been done yet. This is still very much in the works, but the fact that there's, these conversations are happening is encouraging. And I do hope that this momentum keeps on, beyond whenever the end of the pandemic might be, because a lot of these changes, as I think has been echoed by everyone so far, have been needed for a long, long time. So one of the key measures has been around sort of expanding eligibility for free school meals, removing that income threshold, which has been backed by the National Food Strategy, and we've been calling for, along with other colleagues in the sector for a long time. And one of the really, I think, positive measures that has been brought about has been, I guess, a focus in public discourse on the need for this kind of support and the mechanisms by which families have to deal with it. So, never in a million years would we have imagined that we'd be having genuine conversations about the need for, say, cash first payments for families and the dignity that this can afford families. But we've seen them in the last few weeks. So these are some positive steps that I think we're having in public discourse. And I do hope this comes into government. The other thing I think has been quite positive has been seeing intergovernmental departments to some extent working together on this across DFE, DWP, and I think we'd all agree that this is very much needed. Child food poverty isn't a matter that, as Anna said, falls neatly within one department or not. So I guess it's something that's been temporarily positive, but we'd like to see this continue because it's vital that it does. This isn't just an issue for the pandemic.
Thank you. So unless anyone's got anything they want to add on that, I'm going to bring in Nick Fletcher, who's got some more questions to ask you. Nick.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, panel. It's good to see you all today. The past few weeks, there's been some concerns about the quality of food available to families during this lockdown. Now, as we all know, much of what we see on social media is negative, and it obviously spreads really fast, but there's definitely been some issues there. If any urgent changes are to be made with the government support, what would that be? I think, Azmina, you've just come on to some of those things, so maybe if we went to maybe Garry and Lindsay on this one, please.
Yeah, I think that probably my colleagues Anna and Lindsay could talk more about the contents of the food book, the food parcel. I think, speaking from a food bank charities point of view, there's an issue of dignity here that needs to be addressed. We in the food bank network treat people with respect, treat people with dignity when we give a food parcel over, but ultimately that can never replace the dignity of having enough money in your own pocket to be able to put food on the table for your own children. And I think that a lot of the anger from the public was about the fact that that food parcel took away agency from parents and therefore took away dignity So as Azmina spoke about, a cash-first approach where parents and their children can choose food that they're going to eat, that they enjoy, would be really preferable for us. So yeah, I think that would be the main point for me on that.
Okay, Lindsay.
I mean, Nick, as I think you know, the main work we do is on redistributing surplus. I'm afraid I'm not an expert on the statutory provision side of food. I am aware that the government guidelines are fairly comprehensive around the quality of what a food parcel should be. I also understand that there is the option, but it's at school level. Although I think this is changing as to whether that is a cash payment or whether it's a food parcel, and we certainly think that the parents should be in the position of choice around that. But I'm not really in a position or a place to understand what the system's failure was around that resulted in that photograph. What I can tell you is the vast majority of food that we redistribute is fresh produce that comes directly from farmers.
Anna?
Thank you. It's a really important question. So I think, first of all, as you note, we've seen probably the really bad stuff on social media, and they were disgraceful, those food parcels. There's no other word for them. But there's been a huge amount of really good work and really fantastic food parcels which have been provided by very many schools caterers. So we mustn't take away the impression that is that's the norm. I think that's the first important. And I think also very importantly, the government spoke up extremely quickly and said how those parcels were not acceptable. So I think in the short term, the actions which have been taken which needed to be taken have been taken. I think however, this has been, so that's the story around the quality of the parcels was one of several really big challenges around free school meals, which have been highlighted in the last 12 months. We've had the issue of children getting a replacement when they're at home, the vital importance of children who are on free school meals, the importance of that meal for those families and for those children in terms of their diets, and then what happens to those children in the holidays. And I think we had a really good package announced by the government in November for dealing with the holiday provision and also boosting Healthy Start over the coming 12 months to the end of 2021. What we haven't really got into is the extent to which the pandemic's revealed some of these quite significant kind of cracks in the current provision around free school meals, which is why we've supported the request for a review of free school meals to look at some of these problems which were there before the pandemic, but the pandemic's really shone a light on how many difficulties that's creating for these households. So I think now's the time to really start to look at what happens in the medium term, and to really make sure we have a package in place, given we know that disadvantaged children have suffered disproportionately as a result of the pandemic, both from education and other reasons, that we have the right package in place for them going forward.
Thank you for that. Just one question, slightly off topic with that. You discussed rightly about the dignity of families being able to provide for themselves. And I know it's only a very small minority, but there was also concerns of the vouchers not being spent what they should be spent for. Do you have any evidence of that, and what are your thoughts on that? Azmina, you put your hand up, please.
I can come in on that. I mean, one of the things that we spoke about a lot in the first sort of tranche of the lockdown was around sort of vouchers and how they're used. And I'll say that, we spoke to a lot of parents through our services, our partner services. We run a program which helps sort of councils and voluntary sector organizations deliver emergency financial support to families and individuals, so through those networks as well. And really the main issue that we kept finding wasn't around parents misusing vouchers. It was about parents not being able to necessarily get to the right shops where they were easily cash-inable. Often it was only at supermarkets where you had to drive to. They weren't often available at local shops. Or it was about parents not being able to use the online system. We didn't hear, and we spoke to a lot of different providers and parents, we didn't hear about people abusing the system. What we did hear about were parents actually trying to adapt to a very difficult and quickly changing situation. And the mechanisms of support were changing as well. And they were trying to sort of keep up with how they were eligible and how they could feed their children. The voucher scheme wasn't perfect. I think it's better than, not having that choice. But as we've said, cash first is always best because it gives parents those options. We understand where vouchers have to be used, where it's better, but time and time again, we've mainly heard about parents just trying to do the best they can for their children and provide during what has been a really difficult time.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for coming on that. The second part of this question was obviously regarding the quality of the parcels and the way that it was handled over a fortnight ago. Do you think that was just down to the exceptional circumstances of the lockdown and the way that it came around obviously very quickly, or government departments actually understanding the issues on the ground? Could you like to come in on that, Garry, please?
I think it's difficult for me to say. I'm sort of removed from the conversation that happened between the organisation that provided the food parcel, whether the local authority or government were involved in that conversation. I think clearly that food parcel wasn't good enough. I know that the company had talked about measures to improve things in that particular school, and I think really all I can add is that I'm really glad that government came out straight away, said this was unacceptable and asked for action to be taken. But I really do think that's something that perhaps through the investigation, as Anna has spoken about, we'll be able to get into, so that we can make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. If it is free school meals that we have to rely on to make sure that the children can be fed.
Okay, thank you.
Do you mind if I just come in 1 minute, just to I wasn't sure if some of the other witnesses were more involved in those discussions at all, but also what your thoughts are on some of those, which some of them did seem to be the exception rather than the rule, but it sort of opened up in the public's conscience that the idea of being given food and having no choice was perhaps a thing that people found shocking, not just the quantity, and some of them were small, but even with the correct quantity, that sense that the public realised actually there's no choice in this for those children. And we all know how fussy children can be, and if you want them to eat, good food, often you do need to buy the food that children will eat. I don't know if you had some thoughts on that, or does that just build on what you said already, Azmina?
I think what Anna said, that there are sort of organisations and caterers and schools who are doing a fantastic job. I think that is worth saying, and I think I'd be wary of turning parents away from going to get support as well, thinking that they might get sort of a meagre package. I echo what everyone else has said, that those particular pictures that were doing the rounds were disgraceful, and no family should be sort of having to get that. It's very difficult. I know we've been involved in some conversations. It's very difficult to know what the full picture is and what sort of a representative picture, because this is very much sort of done on a local basis by different caterers, different schools, different local authorities. Everyone's got quite sort of unique organisations and arrangements on the ground as they're working. I think at the start of the year as well, there was a bit of confusion about when the voucher scheme was starting, and some schools are sort of filling that gap. We know that's no excuse for sort of any substandard packages that parents got, but it is a changing situation. I'd echo what everyone else said, that it's heartening to see that reaction and to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that it has hopefully, as you say, cemented that view that parents need that choice, and where possible, if they're able to use the vouchers or have cash support to be able to make that choice for their families, that's the best option there is.
Thank you. Sorry, Nick, I'll come back to you.
Okay, Chair. There are many government schemes helping families access food, including free school meals and Healthy Start vouchers. There's also a wider welfare system and the support that the councils can offer vulnerable families. What do you see as the gaps in the safety net that means some children are still going hungry? My concerns around this is we were told by local councils that they could manage things, give more targeted supply. But I still see local councils doing blanket help, and locally we've seen, occasionally we've seen food vouchers on Facebook. So I think sometimes we really need to get to the people that are falling through the gaps. How can you help government, or how can you inform government to make sure that we get to these and we get a real targeted help, which is what I think that we need. I see Garry put his hand up on that one.
Yeah, so I think in terms of sort of wider support, it is important to acknowledge that there was significant help from government, and it did make a difference. It would have made a difference to millions of families. So you're talking about things like the job retention scheme, the self-employment income support scheme, crucially the £20 uplift universal credit, which will have targeted, if you want to talk about targeting, we've targeted millions of families on the lowest incomes that needed it the most. We only saw 4% of people referred to our food banks during this crisis were furloughed. It really did protect the children of those families who were. I would also point to the COVID winter grant scheme that went to councils, which I think is what you're zeroing in on, which is very welcome in terms of being an important component of a wider safety net. I mean, the issue really is kind of threefold for me. So you've got the fact that incomes from benefits aren't sufficient, that government debt is pushing people into poverty, and there isn't enough of that local support. So if I may, I would suggest like the three answers to those three issues would be: number one, that government lock in that £20 uplift to universal credit. If that doesn't happen, we could see a further, according to the Resolution Foundation, 730,000 children being pushed into poverty. It's not some incredibly generous increase. It's instead redressing years of cuts that have preceded it. Secondly, on the point of people repaying that government debt, we would ask for a fairer system there. So people are being given money with one hand by the government with universal credit, but it's being taken away again through deductions too often. So people who've taken out an advance to bridge the 5-week wait are having that knocked off subsequent months' payments, which is leaving them without enough. And finally, we need to see this COVID winter grant scheme extended as well. To bring England in line with, say, for example, Scotland and Wales, we would recommend about £250 million a year should go to councils. Councils have got a really important role to play here, and I would applaud councils up and down the country actually who have also played their part in protecting people who are shielding. Through decent, proper local welfare assistance that is funded long term, councils can plan, they can put systems in place. If I had one criticism of that £170 million, it's that at the moment 80% of it is ring-fenced for food. You should give councils the flexibility to bring in systems so you can link people back into their communities. You can start tackling some of the underlying reasons why people are in poverty. So things like debt advice, for example. That would be a huge help and would strengthen the safety net. But I think, as others have said, long term, we need to seize on this new consensus that we've seen growing. We've seen significant action from government. We've seen concern from the public. We need cross-governmental action to make sure that we end the poverty which sits and underpins food poverty.
Yeah, Lindsay, please.
Bill, I agree with everything that Gary's just said, and Garry has given a very good articulation of the centralised support system. The very, very quick point I want to make is please don't forget in your deliberations or recommendations to also build in resilience for the local community groups that provide a really, really fundamental part that makes society, community cohesion really, really strong. Far too often, people think that the voluntary sector looks like big organisations like the four of us on this panel today. Actually, the real strength of the voluntary sector in the United Kingdom are those local community groups that are known by the people who need the support, and they play a fundamental part in this, as well as everything that Garry has identified.
Azmina?
Thanks. I just wanted to add something to what Garry said around local welfare assistance as well. We also agree on that sort of £250 million number needed per year to bring funding for crisis support in England, to level it up with that in the other nations. And actually, our research from before the pandemic showed that in the last 10 years, funding for local welfare or similar crisis support had fallen by 55% since 2010. And that 1 in 7 local authorities in England no longer have some form of local welfare support. So the recent injections of cash, including the £117 million winter grant, were incredibly important and well received, but they need to be sustained. And actually, they've been used and operationalised quite successfully. We surveyed some local authorities in December on how they'd been spending the money. Many had been using to provide free school meal support, supermarket vouchers for eligible pupils, but also extending that to young carers, children who'd left care recently, and also sort of infants who had pupil premium eligibility. They were also using it to bolster existing local welfare assistance schemes to help families with other things aside from food, which is really key, as you mentioned, Garry. So it's utility bills or other financial support, helping families who are fleeing domestic violence, in emergency accommodation. And another heartening thing we saw was that for those local authorities who didn't have a local welfare assistance scheme in place, many had used that grant to make a sort of temporary winter scheme that people could apply to. So these have all been very positive outcomes, but it needs to be sustained. This funding is only in place till March, and we need to ensure that these safety nets are ensured and sort of strengthened. And I guess I would make one point of caution, which is that, it's been incredible having the support through these local mechanisms for families. And I understand that, councils are being encouraged to provide that support, say, throughout the February half term. But I do think that going forward, it's important for us not to conflate these two different mechanisms of support. Both are incredibly important, but fulfill separate roles. Something like free school meals, which is a sort of continued targeted form of support for children in the form of food support, can almost prevent a family from needing to access, say, a local welfare assistance scheme, which isn't only for food, it can be for other forms of support, and not just for families, for individuals as well. Both are incredibly important. And I think going beyond this year, we need to ensure that both are sort of protected so that we don't further create these holes in the safety net, as you mentioned. The only other very quick point I'd like to make is around sort of gaps in the safety net, and that would be to sort of draw attention to those families and the children from low-income migrant families affected by no recourse to public funds, who've actually not been able to access a lot of the support that, Garry, you talked about that had been introduced throughout the pandemic. We know these families have been incredibly affected. They've had nowhere else to turn. Many of these parents are working in frontline jobs, we know from our services, as NHS workers in social care, and they've had no choice but to work because they can't sign on for any form of welfare support. There's been a really encouraging move in giving them that free school, even giving those children this free school meal support. And I guess that's one thing that is really, really important for us to continue beyond this pandemic, to make sure that they can access that means-tested free school meal support on par with their peers, regardless of their parents' immigration status.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, Chair, so I'll just skip the next question, but just quickly ask, it's always easy to ask for more money and to talk about money. It's obviously increasingly difficult to find, as we will probably see. My question is there anything else that the government can do support-wise that's not money orientated, as in the actual amount of cash on vouchers or on meals? Is there an education piece there? Is there anything else that you gave me 3 fantastic points there, Garry, which I've written down. Is there anything else that you can think that is not the financial part of it?
I mean, I would make the point that, just to carry on asking for money for one moment, is that money that goes into the pockets of people at the bottom of the income scale gets spent in this economy. We have got to build back after this disaster, this economic disaster, the people spending money in local shops, which is what these people do, can only help. I think I would probably, in terms of non-money support from government, I would again stress the kind of the cross-governmental cooperation that we saw. That I was really impressed by the first tranche of funding for local welfare, for example, where lots of different government departments put aside kind of barriers which have been in place because of the crisis situation, and brought in really significant changes that I wouldn't have expected to have seen without this. So better communication across government, and focus on income rather than food being the answer to poverty, I would say.
Thank you for that. I'm back to you, Chair.
Very good, Nick. So you've managed to get a suggestion there that doesn't involve a spending commitment. So that's very helpful. I know Jonathan was going to come in and ask some questions, and so we've got until 4:30, so we haven't got a huge amount of time. So I guess if we just try and make sure that we don't go over what we've already, because this was a very rich session, so it'd be good to be able to get through all the different topics that we've got. So Jonathan, are you there? Have you got some questions?
I am indeed, Chair.
Great.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sorry for being slightly delayed. Wi-Fi playing up on me. I've been fascinated by the conversation. I'm going to kind of go off-piece from the script slightly then, with the limited time, and ask, because I worked for the panels and the witnesses. I was a secondary school teacher in London and Birmingham. I was also head of year. So I want to make it very clear from the beginning, I'm fully supportive of free school meals during term time, as they have been administered for decades. I do have reservations over the idea of free school meals into the holiday period as somehow being one way in which it will solve a long-term problem. Garry, I was really pleased to hear you mention the income side of it. I think that's ultimately where we need to target on all this, and I completely agree. In Stoke-on-Trent, we earn £100 less per head than the average household in other parts of the UK. So I fully understand and agree and support the income, and it links back in with education. I suppose if I throw out a couple of questions and let the panel come in, one of the questions would be, I'm a conservative, so it won't shock you. I'm going to ask about the role of the state versus the role of the individual. How do we ensure, I do believe in the idea that the individual has an important role to play, and wherefore the state should be involved to help those most in need. I'm a conservative in One Nationer who believes that it's the responsibility of the state to help the most vulnerable in society. But one thing I do hate, to be quite honest with you, is universality. I have a real concern that when my daughter goes to primary school, that she will be eligible for free school meals just because of her age, when actually, as a parent, I would be able to afford those free school meals myself. And so I have a real problem that we haven't actually done a proper means test. And Azmina, I think you made a good point earlier around the idea of how that eligibility criteria is looked at. And I certainly fully support looking at it, because as we know, you can get the free school meal entitlement. Your parents' income situation may change, but you will remain with the entitlement, even though your parents could be in an eligible place where maybe financially they wouldn't need that support like they once did. So something around that. I'd also be really interested to hear about the holiday solution. Obviously, we've heard about the idea, Azmina, sorry, I'm just saying because I heard you say it, I'm sorry if others did as well, about the idea of free school meals into holidays. Obviously, the holiday clubs is something I'm a big advocate and supporter of, and I think that's a really positive step, because not only do you get the food support, you get physical exercise, mental health, well-being checks, and safeguarding opportunities. So how do we go bigger and better with that? Is something I'm a big supporter of. I'll quickly add on the cash first thing. I'm sorry to say I am nervous of that, not because I don't trust parents. I think that is a stigma and it's something that's not fair. My worry is, how do we ensure that food bought is healthy and nutritious, particularly when we see, major marketing from the sugar and sweet treats. And I'm someone who's larger than I should be. So, I fall for the buy 3 chocolate bars for £1 at the Asda checkout. I fall for that trap every time. How do we ensure that, and I suppose that then links in finally, sorry, Chair, with the education. One of my biggest frustrations, I suppose, with food education at the moment is not learning about the basics of food in the sense of a carbohydrate. I didn't realise until I actually started one day working out many moons ago that there was things as complex carbohydrates, which are better to have than just simple ones. I didn't understand about how to try and do a food shop even really on a budget at university. I remember regularly just falling into the trap of thinking that, you know, the offers that were there were somehow better than actually maybe just getting the store's own brand and stuff. So how can we improve food education and obviously teaching those skills around cooking that will therefore ultimately lead to, you know, hopefully better choices when it comes to buying food and how we prepare meals and store them long term. So I appreciate I've just thrown out loads of stuff there, but I'm very happy to be put in my place or told otherwise. Lindsay, I saw your hand up, so I'll go with you first.
You've put a huge amount out there, Jonathan, but I see Lindsay's itching to come in, and I would also say, I'll just throw in there, you seem to be advocating for something along the lines of Sure Start, Jonathan, that did teach cooking and healthy eating. But anyway, Lindsay, I'll bring you in.
Well done, Catherine.
Jonathan, I'm not sure I'm going to address everything that you just raised, but I would like to link a couple of them. You started with questioning around the role of the state, and I think there are some areas where the state does have an absolute role. And so to go to your very final point, I think we need a complete a systems review of our approach to food in the United Kingdom. You're talking to Henry Dimbleby later. He's done a lot of listening with the support of Anna and her team up and down the land, and I ask the government to listen to the National Food Strategy. I would personally like to see every single young person leave education being able to knowing how to cook, and it seems bizarre that we teach skills that are never used, and yet there's a skill that we need to deploy 3 times a day and have a major impact on our ability to be able to feed efficiently our families when we are parents ourselves. So, you know, that point, it's a very big point. It's turning around an oil tanker, but I think it's something that the government should be committed to. In terms of the holiday provision, and I just very quickly make a point on that and give way to my colleagues. We haven't talked yet about the holiday provision on the activity club side. Like you, I am a major advocate of that. We support over 50,000 families and children every year, and indeed that is how Marcus first got in touch with this whole issue, because we were providing food to a holiday program, a very local one, in his local community, and there is an opportunity, but it requires a piece of joined up government. In the United Kingdom, we waste a huge amount of food. It is 7 times cheaper to redistribute surplus food than it is to buy food. The government has committed fantastically a large amount of money this year to fund holiday clubs. We would love to make sure that taxpayers' money goes as far as possible by making sure that as much of the food that is provided to those clubs, which is absolutely at the most nutritional, high value food, so fresh produce, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, dairy and protein, is provided from the surpluses that exist in our own food system. And if that's not building back better in a post-Brexit Britain, I don't know what is.
I say thank you so much for that. That's fascinating. 7 times cheaper. And Lindsay, I know that I think as MPs, we had invitations to your organisation, and, you know, very keen to take that offer up. I do regularly attend the food banks in my area. I do stay in touch with all of them to sort of gauge what's happening on the ground, and I have done surgeries privately, obviously not advertised, to make sure we pick up the casework and reach out to those individuals. Just to put on the record, I'm a huge Hillary Cottam sort of late convert radical help. You know, that I was told by a really good socialist friend of mine, Danny Flynn, he won't mind me saying that, who runs the YMCA here in Stoke, and I'm a convert. So if Danny and I can get on the same page, I don't see why we can't do something quite radical to shake things up and do something different. And Catherine, quickly before I go to Garry, I will just quickly say, I know you said short start, I call them family hubs these days, which I'm sure you'll appreciate is the angle I'm going to take on that one.
I think, Garry, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, lots of really interesting questions there, Jonathan. I think to the biggie about what should be states' responsibility, I think there's a big, important national conversation that we have to have about that. Now, I've worked at the Trussell Trust for about 4 years. We represent about 425 separate organisations, 1,200 food banks, and I think over those years, I've spoken to most of those. And what we've done over those past 4 years is, together with the Food Bank Network, agreed that we need to get to a place where nobody should need emergency food because they can't afford it. That really is the clear message from those small community organisations to us. I think there is an important conversation though that needs to be had about some of these wider supports. So we undertook a piece of research, our kind of flagship piece of research called The State of Hunger with Heriot-Watt University. It listed 3 key drivers that send people and therefore children into food banks. The biggie is income from benefits, hence my track today. But it's also unfortunate life events and then formal and informal supports. So what we're finding is that, you see family breakdown, you get illness, you get disability. So people with illnesses and disability, by the way, are massively overrepresented in food banks. The benefit system isn't catching them, but also what's important is that informal support. And I think that more people should come together, civil society, business, charities, government, to talk about that informal support. It is important. But the very, very clear message from the Food Bank Network is it should be the state's job to ensure that people aren't going hungry because they can't afford it. That's what the Food Bank Network is.
Garry, sorry, very quickly, one of the concerns I have with how we do things in government is cliff edges. I don't understand why we don't have tapering systems in all kinds of things. I just feel that there's too many cliff edges. Are there particular cliff edges that you guys have come across that you think, are a barrier to that, like you say, that support, but also obviously the income that, the welfare state may play a part in?
Universal credit, if it were properly funded, should solve that problem. It's really important to remember that it's an in-work and an out-of-work benefit. If people's money weren't deducted to repay advances, if the level was set at a decent level, then you could move more people onto it and they wouldn't have to worry about cliff edges. They could move into work. That was the vision of universal credit. And if it were properly funded, we've never seen what it can do as a benefit. It should be a poverty fighting machine, but because of some structural issues with it, and because crucially it's been underfunded, it's never been able to live up to its potential.
Thank you.
Thank you. So do you want to come in, Anna and Azmina, on those as well?
Yeah, I know we're short of time, so I'll be really quick. You've raised some really, really important sort of fundamental questions. I wanted to just pick up on one aspect, which was you talked about some of the problems that we've got in actually educating children around food. We've got some good stuff in the curriculum, but it's not yet been sort of properly rolled out across all schools. You also talked about the problem of the buy one, get one free, the kind of environment in which we're making food decisions, which doesn't help us to eat well. And we see that in our children's diets. Half of our children are getting half of their calories from these foods that we call high fat, sugar and salt. They're really foods that are not good for us to be eating in large quantities. But I think those 2 things are the very reason why actually universal infant free school meals offer so much potential, because it's actually setting in place a kind of culture in schools with the very youngest children around how to eat well, how to eat a nourishing meal together, developing those taste preferences, which we know are set down in early childhood, creating a culture around sitting down and talking to your teachers and your friends around a good meal. And I think that's a really critical part of that education process that you've said, that you've highlighted. I think we haven't made the most of that opportunity yet as much as we could. There's more to be done, but I think it creates a really critical foundation for that agenda that you've described.
Anna, well done. You've spun that perfectly back on me. I'm gonna have to go away and have a think now about how you put that on me there, because at Michaela, the school obviously in Brent, they all the children eat the same meal, at a table in a family setting. I'm a huge advocate of that, but I hadn't actually considered how that is technically therefore a universal benefit for all, but was actually teaching those skills. You've well done. You made me go away and think harder now. Well done.
Good. Azmina.
Well, I was actually going to say that universal infant free school meals normalizes healthy eating, and there's been a lot of research by the University of Essex recently that it's been having an impact on healthy weight for young people as well. So just pointing that. And I guess another point, and this maybe comes back to what you were saying about us having to look at eligibility for free school meals. They will, we know that the current thresholds mean that many children, close to 1 million, are missing out. And that universal infant school meals means that we catch those young people who would otherwise be living in poverty but not receiving that support. I don't know if we have time to get into this. I'm very happy to continue this conversation or send some information around the sort of income thresholds conversation, because you mentioned around cliff edges, but also about eligibility. So I'm very happy to share some information off this about that. We've got plenty of research around this.
Well, the other thing I was going to come back in on, because it ties in with what we're not quite going to have time to cover now, but it does go back to Jonathan's point about universality, because he mentioned that he's a big fan of the sports clubs, out of school clubs and holiday camps. And I guess it would be a question for Jonathan, but question for you as to what you think, because it is part of Marcus Rashford's three issues that he would like to see addressed, that this isn't just about food, it's about the sort of the broader educational and sport input for children to really combat that poverty, and whether that should be universal, because why should only certain children be able to attend a summer camp when actually your best friend might not be eligible, and you go to the sport camp and they don't, whereas you would only want to go if you can go with your friend, and that's often how it works for children. So just some thoughts on that, on whether actually that'd be another way of combating Jonathan's reluctance to universalism, that actually if we're going to roll out summer camps, they should be open to all children so that they're inclusive. Be interested to hear your views on that.
Well, if I can quickly, sorry, come in, Catherine. The Hub Foundation, I'd love to put them on the record, sorry, and being cheeky for a plug in my own area. But the Hub Foundation is set up by Carol Shanahan, who's the co-chair and co-owner of Port Vale Football Club. And they do some really, really amazing stuff in this area. And I'm always very happy for the committee to see what they're doing, and would love the witnesses to come and hear from them. Adam Yates, a former professional footballer, is actually now leading it. It's a remarkable group that do as much outreach work as they're possible. And I think you've raised a really interesting point, Catherine, about those clubs. Look, I put on the record again, I make no secret, I was very privileged to go to a private school. I was first in my family to do so, and I had everything, that I could possibly want, and actually look back and regret not probably taking advantage of everything that I quite literally had. And sport and extracurricular was just sort of normalized, like talking about with the free school meals. It was normal to have like 8 different clubs on a Monday night to go to if you wanted to, and choose what you wanted. And sadly that isn't the case, like you say, many state schools, even the ones I worked in.
Yeah. So Lindsay, did you want to come in on that?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Is it part of your thinking, or are you focused only on the food aspect rather than the sort of holiday activities? Because I know you've mentioned the COVID winter grant scheme, and that councils can identify children and families most in need with food and other essentials, and then obviously the local authorities could have that role in identifying and supporting, and have been the vehicle for supporting holiday activities and food programs. And it's good that that funding is now being put in place for 2021. Are you happy with that? Is that something that you support? I guess fundamentally the question is it the best use of the money that is available? Because we know there isn't endless money, so we have to make sure that the money that is spent is used in the most effective way possible. Has anyone got any thoughts on that? Or what? I guess I'll come to you because we need to end, but I guess my question to you is, what would be your number one priority? And it'd be interesting to see if it was different. And if somebody names their number one priority, come up with a different one. So whoever goes last will have the hardest job. But basically, to sort of distill this down, what would be your number one ask of the government, that when we debate this in Parliament and put it to the Minister, what can we put to them? Shall I start with you, Anna, since you're unmuted?
Sorry, just to clarify, Catherine, are you talking about priorities that have already been supported, or in addition to what's already there?
No, I mean, what would be, so I was asking about holiday activities, and just interested in your views and whether that's a good use of funding, and whether that's something you'd like to see made on a permanent basis, because at the moment it's on an ad hoc basis. And then the second question, which is to round up, is what would be your number one ask? So if it's part of what's already being asked, but what is the top priority for you?
Okay, so I think certainly I'm of the view that the Holiday and Activities Fund, as we've got good experience through these pilots, it's providing this huge mix of activities alongside a really healthy meal is a great package and well worth the investment for that holiday period. Don't think it needs to be exclusive for children on free school meals. There's no reason why other children couldn't pay for that kind of provision and have that in place over the summer holidays, the long break, because we know it's so important to keep children stimulated and engaged as well as well fed over the summer. In terms of what needs to happen next, I think it's important that we move on to the third of the asks in Marcus Rashford's petition, which is thinking about the children that are not yet at the moment eligible for free school meals but are living in poverty. That is estimated to be about 1.2 million children. We're hearing directly from them in our surveys, and the situation is they're forced into eating very poor quality food when they're in those circumstances. And so I think our attention should immediately move to them.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Who'd like to come next? Lindsay?
Totally agree with the point that Anna's made about the holiday provision, and linking that to the final comment, which is what I'd like to see. I'd like to see a long-term, beyond the life of any one Parliament approach taken to the whole breadth of the conversation that we've had today. We're really pleased to see the emergency processes that have been put into place for 2021. We're really pleased that this evidence gathering is happening. What we'd like to see is a long-term plan with long-term provision put into place.
Okay. And Garry or Azmina, have you got some final comments? Azmina?
I can jump in. So very much agree with Anna's point about expanding eligibility to free school meals, so we make sure that the system we have in place actually serves all children in poverty who need them. And to be a bit more specific, that means keeping the temporary extension to those affected by NRPF, making that permanent, and also removing the income thresholds currently in order to receive it. I know this is kind of continuing from what Jonathan was saying earlier, but currently family incomes need to be £7,400 or less a year in order to qualify for free school meals. That's incredibly low. We're missing a lot of children who might otherwise be eligible, but it also acts as a work disincentive. And it may well mean that there are many families. We did some research with University of York and Child Poverty Action Group a few years ago, which found that this could affect around 280,000 families. Because they'd be trapped in a poverty trap of, they'd be worse off if they were earning more rather than losing free school meal support. So there's a lot of reason for removing that and actually making all children whose parent or guardian is in receipt of universal credit eligible for free school meals.
So go to work and end up with less to eat and less food to put on the table. Yeah. Garry, have you got some final? Credit. Yeah. Have you got some final comments, Garry?
If I could have one thing, it would be locking in that uplift universal credit. It's been a lifeline for people. If that uplift is taken away, then the responsibility for looking after the families is going to fall to volunteers in food banks during a pandemic, and that isn't right.
Okay, thank you. Can I say thank you very much to all of you? It's been a really rich session. There's a huge amount to take away and a lot to do as well. And so it's been really interesting. And I have to say, from my own perspective as an MP from the North East, we have the highest number of children on free school meals. We've got the busiest food bank in the West End of Newcastle, and I've got a FareShare depot in my constituency. So I'm a big supporter personally of all the work that you do. So just thank you for that and for all the people that you support and help at this time, because I know as a constituency MP for my post bag what that means to local people at the moment. And thank you as well to Anna and Azmina for everything you're doing. And we'll take all this away and hopefully have a debate in Parliament and put these issues directly to the government. So thank you. So we'll move on to our next panel. I think if Henry and Anne are here, if they want to turn their cameras on. And before we start our questions, I'll just ask you both to introduce yourselves as well. Thank you.
Shall I start? I'm Anne Longfield.
Yes, thanks, Anne.
I'm the Children's Commissioner for England.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Henry Dimbleby. I am the independent lead of the Government Commission National Food Strategy. And prior to that, in 2013, I was the co-author of the School Food Plan, which was also commissioned by government and led, among other things, to the introduction of universal infant free school meals, which you've just been discovering, and also the addition of cooking onto the curriculum as compulsory for every child up to the age of 14.
Great, thank you. So I know you've both been involved in debates around children's access to healthy food for a long time, and you're both very strong spokespeople in this area. So thank you for the work that you do. It'd be interesting to hear from you why you think the response to Marcus Rashford's campaign by the public has been so high, why the number of signatures is so high, and how he's managed to make the impact he has. What do you think are the reasons? What do you think are the lessons that we can learn from it?
Who do you want to start?
Yeah, sorry, go on, yeah.
So I think Marcus Rashford has captured the mood, first of all, of the nation, and the mood during a particular time during the pandemic, where it's been a huge shock to people, even those that have had a relatively secure lifestyle. It's been a huge shock to them. A lot of people have suffered financially during this period, and know people, and I think more people have got a taste of what it's like not to have that security around food. You know, some people have had to apply for universal credit who never thought that was part of their world, and now they are. And of course, you know, a well-known individual who can tell that story, and that story is just incredibly powerful, of the difference it made to his life and why it's so important. And he's been kind of relentless with that in a very positive way. And I think what that has revealed is that the nation actually wants to care for each other, is concerned, and I think the pandemic has shone a light on what vulnerabilities mean. I've struggled to kind of get that over sometimes in real life terms, but I think we've all seen what that means during the pandemic. And actually the mood is one where we want to reach out and do their bit. And I think we saw that when the cafes all did their bit during the October half term. And I think that even though those were some of the people who were struggling the most, you know, hospitality really hit during this time, they knew what it meant and they wanted to do their bit, and they knew people in that situation. And I think it's one that, you know, having got there, I think with the nation, we're not going to go away from that. It now is part of what I think we can rightfully define as the way we think.
Henry, have you got something to add to that? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, two things. I think, first of all, good policy meets in the combination of anecdote and story with evidence and data. And you have constantly to be playing those off against each other, looking at the data, understanding what you think it means, and then going back to life stories and anecdote, and really kind of playing them off against each other until you get something that will actually work. And I think that Marcus, in a person, kind of exemplified that. He gave voice to those stories from you know, a voice that's actually very rarely heard. People who have that story are quite rarely given access that he has, and he did that very, very powerfully. And the second thing, I think the most powerful thing he said all the way through, I thought, the thing that constantly strikes me was he had this line about how people don't worry about asking, they don't feel embarrassed to ask for help with their maths, and yet it's embarrassing to ask for help when they can't feed themselves. And I think he did a lot to remove the stigma from people in those positions, which comes to my second point, which is I think we all know, or almost all of us know, people who've lost their jobs over the last year, and as Anne said, who many of whom couldn't believe for a minute that they would be the kind of person who would rely on the state for support. And I think that has changed people's attitude towards people who rely on the state for support almost completely. It's one of the things that happened in this pandemic very, very quickly.
So what lessons do you think the government should take away from this period of stepping up to support vulnerable families during COVID-19 and beyond this pandemic as well? What lasting impact do you think there should be? What things would you put down to being short-term support that's been through this crisis, and what actually should we be seeing in the longer term as more sustainable long-term changes coming out of this? Henry, do you want to start this?
Shall I start? So clearly the government got itself into a bit of a muddle before Christmas and actually before the summer, where the combination of the dynamic between the two parties and kind of long-term political positions got confused with actually what needed to happen. And I think that with the response to the second of Marcus's campaigns, they've really got themselves out of that space, and they have moved towards structural solutions to the problem, short term at the moment, but structural solutions. And I think that the work that I'm still working on part two, I'm looking at a number of these issues again, free school meal extension, etc. And it feels to me like a very different dynamic within government now, that there's a lot of thought going on the combination of what you were talking about before, what needs money, and ensuring that the universal credit system supports those people who most need support, and where benefits in kind might also help. And I think that's the space, really thinking very deeply about where these are welfare issues and where benefits in kind can provide something that simply money itself can't provide. And I think if you look at Healthy Start, Holiday Activity Fund, free school meals, those provide something actually that can't be provided simply by a cash extension, but they're not a substitute for it. They are something in the long term that should be seen as a solution to a problem in themselves.
Mm-hmm. When you say benefits in kind can't be, sorry, you just said they can't be provided by cash instead. I mean, isn't that a choice though, really, that potentially everyone could pay for these services, their food, their holiday clubs, and if they had enough income to do so, they might, that's what they would choose to spend their money on. Is it that they can't be provided, or is it just that some things are within the system now, they are provided as a benefit in kind, rather than putting more money into the universal credit system so that parents can pay for holiday clubs, childcare, food, school holiday meals?
Well, I mean, that's definitely a school of thought that actually everything should be in cash, and cash is the most dignified way of providing support. And I think that that is very largely the case. And I think you have to be quite careful how you think about things that aren't cash supports. But if you look at, for example, universal infant free school meals, which we argued for very strongly in the school food plan, and which was put into place for infants, and I would like to see extended to all in primary school, there are, as you were just discussing, some very specific provable benefits in terms of culture of schools, healthy eating, the way in which you bring together pupils from all backgrounds that universal infant free school meals gives. Likewise, Healthy Start, it is, whatever you think about it, is demonstrable that if you provide people with Healthy Start versus the equivalent in cash, very significantly the families eat healthier. And then finally, the holiday activity and food programs. Again, what you're trying to do there is and it's in the short term initially, but I hope it'll run long term, bridge that gap between, for the children in the holidays, when children who are from less affluent families fall behind and have less support. And again, there's evidence that shows that is more effective than the same amount of cash. So I think you have to be very careful about not being paternalistic and trying to enforce a particular view on what people should spend money on. But at the same time, you have to think about what is best for the children. And in certain cases, the evidence pushes you very strongly towards doing something over and above benefit support itself.
Okay, thank you. And
Okay, I've got a bit of a list, so you might have to just stop me. First of all, the scale of families who don't have the assets at their disposal to draw on when things get tough. I think we've seen that now. You know, people can see what that means. They can understand that some people live in big houses, some people live in very tiny places with, you know, not enough rooms, not enough outdoor space and the like. So the scale of the need is something. I think that to draw from it, the lived experience, what that means for those children who are in that experience. And certainly, you know, I found it incredibly, well, first of all, shocking, but also then very moving to hear some of the stories from children themselves. But the first time I walked into a school and saw a food bank, I was startled to see a food bank there. It was a shock. It's not what you expected in the entrance to a secondary school. We now see those in many secondary schools, and I don't want that to become the norm. I don't want us to think that it's okay that we just have to have that as part of the norm. Obviously, I'm very pleased they're there doing a very supportive function. So the scale, what the lived experience is, and then I think what we've also learned from it is how it can't be, it's not going to go away. So what we've seen over the last year is a number of times where this has seemed to be a surprise. There's been, as Henry said, you know, a number of occasions where half terms popped up and there's been a problem, a summer's popped up and there's been a problem. What I think really now we need to see is a long-term plan, not just for food, because food at the end of the day, and a lot of people were saying this in the last session, is almost the last defense of poverty, but actually a long-term plan for poverty. I think it has to come out of the whole party system. I think it needs to be cross-party, it needs to be 10, 20 years. And within that as well, a long-term food plan. So actually government can get ahead, can be modelling what the impact of the pandemic or employment is on families' needs and children's needs, and can have the measures in place to do that. And a really important part of that, I think, is some form, what Henry's talking about here, is rebuilding that infrastructure around families, because of course jobs are important, income's important, you know, the safety net's important, but that infrastructure around children and families, which means that there are things in your area that can help alleviate the situation for you, which are around holiday activities. You know, they can be there for you. And I was interested in that discussion you had in the session before about universality and what a private school would operate with extended activities and sports and the like. Well, I would like all schools to operate in that way for all children, just to be the norm. And I'm not trying to frighten any school leaders that might be listening who are worried about having to just stay open and keep open at the moment. But actually, it doesn't need to be teachers that do that, but to use that community asset to really offer that support for families who need help. And if we can look at building that kind of infrastructure as normal, then I think we're going some way with a long-term plan to reduce poverty and help alleviate in the meantime to the place we need to be.
But that comes down to funding that infrastructure, and it does come down to funding it, and it goes back to that Henry's last response about whether universal credit is the way to support families and empower them. At the moment, they're not through universal credit because of, and the last witnesses explained quite clearly why universal credit at the moment isn't functioning quite as well as it could in terms of ensuring the right levels of support for families that are using it. but the government do seem to very committed to universal credit. But the where the gaps are, what is it? What would be your What would be your solution to this? Do we put more money to universal credit, or do we fund more benefits in kind, as Henry puts them?
You kind of have to do both, and that doesn't mean that you just turn a tap on and never turn it off. You have a safety net through welfare that is strong enough and is strengthened from where it is now, because again, as you've already discussed, the theory in universal credit is a very positive theory, but actually there's underfunding points throughout it, which means that families do fall through those gaps, and actually families with children are more likely to. So alongside the uplift, there's also the issues where we know are the pressure points within universal credit around benefits cap and the number of children and the weight. So families start their whole journey into universal credit already owing the 5 weeks. If you were starting, if you could have an upfront payment that was actually payment in advance, which I know will have various people kind of, worrying around about a lot, but, it's a completely different starting point, I think, on that. So a strengthened security system, but then the kind of infrastructure I'm talking about isn't just investment for no ends. It's an infrastructure that helps families flourish. It will provide the holiday childcare that will help someone go to work, which will mean they can become financially independent and won't have to claim the benefits in the long run. I know that most of the people who are classed as poor actually are working, but if you follow my theory within there. So this, I think, is all about enabling families to get on, enabling children to get the best start educationally before they start school, so they have the best chance of getting the grades that we know they need to be able to flourish in later life. At the moment, half of those children that are on free school meals aren't getting more than the basic grades, or even the basic grades when they get to 16. And 40% of that is set before they start school. So there's an awful lot known about how you can help both children get ahead to be better financially independent as adults, but also about how you help families. And just looking at the cost of what a holiday play scheme would be, it's an incredibly cost-effective way of helping people. If you look for a childcare scheme, it would be costly. If you look for a food scheme by itself, it would be costly. You get it all with a holiday play scheme. I'm not saying it is all that's needed, but it's a very cost-effective way of being able to help.
And have you got anything to add on that? Or...
No,
Nope, I think covers it all. Well done, Anne. I was just going to quickly ask one more question about the food package, the current package that the government has announced for those facing food poverty for the remainder of this year. And we know that there have been lots of changes in the government's approach to this, but at the moment they seem very clear that they have announced the package and it's staying that way. And the position at the moment is that they will be withdrawing the £20 uplift to universal credit as well, unless they're persuaded otherwise, which so far they haven't said so. Do you think it's enough to get people through the winter, or do you think they need to be looking at additional support to get us through the rest of 2021, given that we can't predict what's going to happen with this pandemic, but we can hope with the development of the vaccine that there is some at least foreseeable light at the end of the tunnel, and we can certainly make plans for how it's going.
Shall I kick off with that one?
Yeah.
I think the Winter COVID Fund was welcome. Again, I'm always kind of frustrated that there has to be at some stage a row about these things before they come in, but I think that was very welcome, and thanks to Henry for that, for his part in helping make that happen. Clearly, the theory is that this covers this period up until April, although there is confusion over whether it was meant to be spent on this or other things. So the fact there is a scope for confusion, I think, is worrying in itself. I think some councils have done fantastic work and have really ploughed their energies into this. And I think where there have been gaps, and councils have used this opportunity to be able to extend their support in this way is really, really welcome. But as always, if some councils will be able to achieve this more than others, and it's another factor, another stage, if you like, between the families who need that help and the money being committed. So I think that most families would actually prefer cash transfer, and that's what's happened in Northern Ireland. But a voucher actually puts the decision into their hand. That's not to undermine what the council have done, because I think that has been really powerful in a lot of areas. But I do think putting the money into families' hands is the best way to go about it. In terms of the universal credit uplift, I'm firmly of the view that that was a really powerful, generous move. It made a lot of difference to a lot of people during the pandemic. We're not out of the pandemic, and that still needs to remain. And when we look at the amount that it costs about as much as furlough does for 1 month to extend it. And I think we can all see that the furlough scheme is very much needed. And the money was found at that point. So I think the argument remains, why couldn't it be for this one?
Henry, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, so a little bit. So on the winter fund, I think it was clearly the right, I mean, I campaigned for it, so I would say this, but I think it was clearly the right thing to give local authorities the decision about how to use the money. They know the families best, and actually a charity I founded has been working with 30 schools, initially delivering food packages, and our approach working with those schools has changed and shifted as their needs have changed and shifted. So there are some, for example, who live 2 bus stops from the supermarkets. They don't want a voucher and they like the chefs to cook them food, and it's a local thing and it should be done locally. I think that I've been trying to get hold of Richard Watts, who's the head of the LGA, because I don't think there is a confusion over what it was meant for. I think there was a line saying it wasn't meant to be for free school meals, but that was because free school meals during term time were funded out of school funding. But I think really the question on that is, and I don't know the answer to this, is it enough? Because if it's run out and genuinely run out, clearly it should be topped up. And that's a question for government to address with local councils. On the universal credit uplift issue, I'm not an expert on the specifics of universal credit. I know quite a lot about, because I've spent quite a lot of time in food banks, etc., about the 5-week and benefit caps, etc. But all I would say on that is, for families in the wards that we work with in Hackney, some of those families, it's been a complete lifesaver. But also, I wouldn't. The fact that the government's saying it's not going to do things at the moment, there are clearly huge number of balls up in the air before the budget in March, and there are all sorts of things they're saying they're not going to do. So I would be surprised if that doesn't get extended.
Okay. So Mike, I was going to bring you in to ask some questions now, if that's all right.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Hello, Anne and Henry. Good to see you. Very interesting listening to what you've got to say. Anne, you've previously said that money given to councils to help vulnerable families gets tied up in processes, in distribution, in bureaucracies. What do you think can be done to tackle this problem?
Well, I think I'm saying there, what I've just said now is that it's another kind of stage in the chain to getting the food to children. I think some councils have done brilliant things over the last recent months. I think they've really taken this to heart. They've really seen their responsibility as being really needed for those families. So I think that is really helpful. I think locally in some councils, the children's element of it hasn't been as close to the emergency response as some of the other aspects of the council's work, and I hope that that would be something that would change. I think the kind of partnerships we've seen grow locally over the pandemic, where local agencies have worked together much more than they might have done in the past. I mean, not least schools and children's services working together to support vulnerable children has been really, really powerful. And then I think the agencies that can help supply some of the food needed, I think they're in a much better place. I think throughout all of it, there needs to be obviously centralised helps within the local area that can coordinate different partners and ensure the food is getting where it needs to get to. But I think we now have some good examples from councils that have done very well during this period that we can look to and draw from.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's quite a demand on social services, particularly because of lockdown. Obviously, they've got to deal with the child protection side of that. But you make the point there about efficiency. So my local authority runs a hub and organises with all the volunteers the distribution of food through that hub, and it's far more efficient than leaving it to people operating in their own silos, as it were. Yeah. But equally so, the distribution of government through to doorsteps bypasses that. So there needs to be a dialogue between government and local authorities in that respect as well. I recognise that. But in a nutshell, would you have preferred to have seen the £170 million given to council through COVID winter grant schemes spent on other interventions which you think could have a greater impact? Could you have spent the money for better purposes?
Well, I think the money was really necessary at that time. So actually the 170 million needed to be spent on this, in my view. I think there was a question whether it went on vouchers or whether it went direct to families in their incomes. And I think for the longer term, there is a case to be made about direct payments into the bank balance for families. But in terms of building up that kind of community resilience, I think it's been incredibly important. And, the people who have, or the areas that have done it very well will often have, I don't mind what we call them, whether we call them sure starts or family hubs, but, that infrastructure in a local community where families know, where they don't have the stigma around feeling that they can't go there and ask for help, but also that they've got people who will work alongside them to support them, and they don't again feel that worry that they might have if they were talking to children's services. So I think there you've got a ready-made coordination centre in a local area, and I've been first to say you need more of those.
I go back to the point you made earlier, which was a great point, that COVID really has united communities in a way in which we've not seen for a long time, and within that there are many voluntary groups supporting those communities as well. People like the Joseph Browntree Foundation who do good work in my constituency, and let's hope that going forward that we learn from those strengths and continue on in the same spirit. Henry, if I may ask you a question.
Yes, certainly.
Please, in the National Food Strategy, Part 1, you recommended an expansion of the holiday activities and food programme, to which I'm well aware of, and the government included this in their announcement in November. Why do you think this is the best way to tackle the long-standing issues of holiday hunger, and what should be done during half-term holidays, which are not covered by that programme?
So I don't think it's, I think there is, food poverty, IT poverty, all the forms of poverty are poverty. And there is a massive issue with poverty in this country, in the Western world. Inequalities increasing, and that is going to continue for some time. Angus Deaton's commission is constantly producing very gloomy reports on the topic, and I wouldn't dream for a moment that a holiday activity and food program is the best way to deal with poverty. But I do think there are certain interventions. There's a link in food between inequality and in ill health, and I think there are certain interventions where what I call in-kind support, so not just ensuring that people have enough money, has a direct, provable, evidenced impact on the prospects of the children. And the reason that I like the holiday activity and food program, and to your conversation earlier, I think that should include all children. I intend to send my children to ours in Hackney. I will pay for them. But I think they should definitely not just, the schemes run by the school should not be just for children on free school meals. The reason I like that is because during the holidays, not only do children from the least affluent families go hungry, they also go backwards educationally. And this is a fantastic opportunity to feed body and mind. And that is why I think it's a very powerful program. But I don't think it's a substitute for resolving the problems of inequality in our society.
I agree with the fact it's not a substitute, but it's been a necessity for some time. Some local authorities have run holiday food, or what we call holiday hunger schemes, for a long time now. My own local authority does the same. But an interesting fact I picked up from an earlier Zoom that I've been on with the NHS is it appears that a lot of children in school are actually in school now are not only children of key workers, it's also vulnerable children as well.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability includes hunger, nutrition.
Yeah.
That's why, yeah, and that's why the head teachers like these programs as well. In fact, that's why a lot of the head teachers I spoke to, one of the reasons they like the box schemes rather than the voucher was because it gave them they were very worried in the early stages of the pandemic of losing touch with some of the children in the most vulnerable homes. And I'm a governor on a federation of schools here in Hackney, and that was a real concern of the head teacher. So there is definitely that issue as well that feeds into it. And that again is a good reason why holiday activity and food programs, I like holiday activity and food programs.
Yeah, and it just shows you how much the schools are very much part of the community.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So this thing about, I was very interested in the conversation, the previous thing about, state school versus private school, and this idea that, these things shouldn't be seen as extras. Schools are the hubs, particularly primary schools, are massive hubs of local communities. And we should be thinking all the time about how can we add on more, in my view, universal benefits. I think I wouldn't make holiday activity and food a universal benefit, it'd be too expensive. But I think generally our inclination should be towards the universal, rather in primary schools in particular, rather than targeted. Yeah, it's food for thought, sorry. So another proposal recommended in part one of the strategy, but has never been adopted in the government's winter support package, was expanded eligibility for free school meals and Healthy Start vouchers. And in light of the other supports the government has announced, do you think this is still a valuable recommendation, especially given the significant investments it would require? You've just touched on that, I think. Well, I'm going back to that actually in part two of the food strategy. So when we did the work on free school meals in 2013, if you look at the school meal spend, the group of children in the poorest households who aren't eligible for free school meals have the lowest take up of school meals and spend the least. And basically you've got a group of children who are really struggling to feed themselves. Where they are buying free school meals, they're spending it on snacks. And so there is a clear case to expand the eligibility. The discussion I'm having at the moment is whether that should be to universal credit or whether there's some point in between the £17,400 and universal credit. So what I'm trying to do, and actually DWP are being very helpful with the data for next time round, is to try to describe the group of people in work and out of work who are on universal credit and get away from the tropes about, the rich people on universal credit or the people in, Wales getting much more than the people in London, et cetera, and to try and draw that line a bit more finely. But I still definitely think it should be expanded. The question is, to me now, where, and can I cut that with can I paint that with a slightly finer paintbrush in part two?
Fascinating. Sorry, if I disappeared, it's because my battery's running a bit low. Modern technology. I'd like Anne, if you could, to comment on that. But before I do, Anne, the very idea that school meal vouchers are being exchanged for anything but food is an anathema to me, and I can absolutely guarantee that that is not the case in my constituency, certainly not the case in my region. It's a modern myth which unfortunately stigmatizes people, and it's not acceptable. But Anne, do you have anything to say on what Henry's just said there?
Well, I mean, I support the extension. I'm really pleased Henry's doing that work. I think that I would see this as part of a long-term plan about food and about food poverty and poverty. So getting it right will need several different aspects, and I think that's a really powerful one. I'm really looking forward to that. And just going back slightly, sorry, to the universality around schools and that extended support that you could get around schools. It wouldn't just mean you'd have to pay for it. As Henry rightly says, you could have a charging mechanism. Most childcare schemes for holidays do that already, which would have some free places where you'd be able to offer it to all kids, making sure that those kids that needed it most were able to get that place. On the kind of what parents are going to spend their vouchers on, I always find this a really dispiriting part of any conversation which comes up, because in my experience, most families that don't have much food want to buy food for their children, and the vouchers aren't meant to be spent on anything else other than food. If there is a way that someone is somewhere has done that, I'm sure it is possible. I'm sure someone's done it. But we can't base a policy on alleviating poverty and food poverty on someone who is breaking some rule somewhere, allegedly. It's one of those things that gets in the air. It's part of that stigmatizing. It's part of that demeaning place that so many families feel themselves in. And when I think from the food boxes we saw last week, accepting them probably some of the worst ones on social media, it was the demeaning aspect of it that I felt was really the most awful aspect of that. And then alongside that, you see areas that have really got together in terms of that holiday food, and they're doing their absolute best to really fill those boxes with great things. And that's what we should all be trying to do, actually doing our best for those children who need that extra help.
I totally agree there. I had a constituent come to me with a similar food parcel last week. I put it on social media, but they didn't want to come forward or be named because of the effects on the mental health of their child, who would feel stigmatised. And I totally agree with them. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. That's very informative.
Thank you, Mike. Henry, did you want to?
Yes, just Anne said something there which reminded me of something which I hope will be a long-term lesson for government from this pandemic, which is so many good policies are ignored because of worries about a very small number of people using them inappropriately. And it really does, in a very serious way, it stops us helping people. And if you look at whether it was furlough or Sybil's or all of these schemes, what Treasury has done is they have realized that these schemes are fraudable to much larger degrees than stuff in the normal run of things would be defraudable. But they have made the calculation that the benefit is so much greater than the harm that will be done by the fraud. And I think particularly in these areas of poverty, there often is so much time spent thinking about how a small number of people may abuse the scheme, which actually doesn't matter. The question is, what is the net benefit? And I think so many of these things, the net benefit is huge, and we should stop worrying about a small amount of fraud.
I agree, and I think one of the other frustrations that's been expressed with me is that I don't expect you to comment on this, but that the government's been less careful with its procuring of significant amount of money that you would argue has been wasted on contracts for COVID. And you know, obviously, there are arguments and discussions going on about the contracting of during the COVID period, which has been enormous, the level of public procurement that has happened as a result of the pandemic, and then has, in a sense, penny pinched on the food that's gone to children to be able to eat during this period. So I don't expect you to comment, because I appreciate it's a political comment, but that has been a frustration that's been expressed to me, and I think it does feed into what you're saying, Henry, in terms of this worry that some small amount of money may get misused outweighs the benefit of making sure that children grow up with healthy food, and we do need to just get that balance right. Obviously, no money should be wasted, but the fact is, with government spending, money sometimes is, and it's where you're comfortable with that waste and then suddenly uncomfortable. I think that's where some of the questions are being raised. Sorry, Henry, you're going to say something?
I was about to say, I think no money should be wasted is completely wrong. I think you have to accept that money will always be wasted, and then you have to work out what the most efficient way of getting the result you want is, accepting that money will be wasted. If you think no money will ever be wasted, you'll never spend any money.
Well, you've got to at least aspire to it. Anyway,
if we're going to have food parcels, we should be obsessed with what's in them.
Yeah.
So we should be obsessed with checking on what's in them. We should be incensed on making clear what should be in them, and then check in every aspect of that.
Yes. And actually, one of the things that frustrated me about the way the narrative went over those latest pictures of food parcels was, to me, those food parcels exhibited a problem that exists in school meals generally, which is it takes care, attention and passion. We all know how difficult it is to feed our own children, get them to eat healthily. Yeah. It's difficult, and doing school food is difficult, and some people do it very well and some people don't, and some people don't care enough. And I would have liked to have seen the debate around that particular food package become a debate about how leaders in schools and companies serving in schools can serve better free school meals. It was frustrating, because for me that's a really important debate, and it suddenly become another debate about government funding, which actually that was another big issue we've got in society, which is how do you get schools to serve their children well.
And I think the fundamental question is, would you serve that to your child? Would your child eat that? Would that be good for your child? Is that enough for your child? I think that's a fundamental question everyone needs to ask themselves. Just we haven't got too much longer, so I wanted to get down to action, really, in terms of what we need to do now. And in your opinion, does the government already have all the tools, all the information that it needs to tackle these fundamental drivers of child food poverty? What are they missing? Is it, I guess I'll put this directly, is it that they're missing the information? Is it that they are missing the individual in government who is driving this as a strategy? Or is it something else? I don't know who wants to go first. Henry.
One of my recommendations was that that the government should keep a task force in place whose job is to look at the information closely. And by that I mean things such as hospital admissions for malnutrition, polls on where around the country food insecurity is increasing, decreasing, so that they can react in real time. You know, they can have adaptive management and be ahead of the game.
So that's in terms of having the information and the facts and the data.
Exactly.
Then it comes down to who are they presenting that to, and who is answerable for it.
Exactly. So on that, I actually think the first one is more important than the second, because I think if you have the data, it will be stark when it's going wrong, and someone will pick it up. Although I think you do need to address both. And I'm actually, there's still work going on the former, but I am reasonably optimistic that will be happening. But it's not yet decided exactly how it's going to work and where it's going to happen. But it feels to me that there's good progress being made on that. We just need to push it across the line.
Okay. And Anne, you previously said that you don't believe that the government has a long-term strategy for dealing with this. But the government believes it has a holistic strategy. So where do you think, where do you see this as?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the makings of a holistic strategy, but it's pretty fluid at the moment, I think, and it's very much focused on the pandemic. So I'm talking about a long-term plan, both to reduce poverty, but also as food poverty as part of that. And I think that what we're still in the reactive phase, I think there's enough of all of those things you said, the data, the evidence and the like, to be able to actually put in place a plan for the future. I do think that there's been, and I'm talking about poverty here rather than food poverty. Food poverty has kind of been forced into the dialogue, if you like, but poverty, there's still this sense of squeamishness around it almost, and it still seems to fit in this too difficult box. Well, you know, I think across the political divide, actually, this needs to be seen as one of the biggest social and economic issues of our time and needs to be tackled as such. But I do think there needs to be a long-term food plan over the next 3 years, 5 years, and that can't be just to deliver food better and more efficiently. It has to be about reducing the reliance on food for poor families. And I would like to see that as broad as it possibly can be in terms of delivering, again, that national conviction, but also that local support. What I do know is there used to be a poverty unit in government, and it used to sit between DWP and education, and that's not been there for some time. And I actually put a question as whether there was a poverty strategy and where did it live? And of course, the answer to that can't, you know, no one can answer that because there isn't one as such. So I do think those mechanisms are important. They're a means to an end, but they are important with it. And the task force, Henry's task force, clearly is involved in really important work as a part of that, but it needs to go beyond that.
Mm. And so in terms of your task force, Henry, obviously Marcus Rashford's petition, the asks in it are based on part 1 of the National Food Strategy, which you led. And you argued that these steps would shore up the diets of the most deprived children during the pandemic. But obviously the government has adopted some of those asks. But in terms of part 2, where are you going next in terms of building on that momentum?
So part 2 is much broader. So it's going to be dealing with the environment, it's going to be dealing with eutrophication of rivers, the carbon footprint of our agricultural system, international trade. But I'm increasingly convinced that if you look at inequality and if you look at poverty across the Western world, it's something that in the absence of mass conflict has increased in every society, and it's going to be around. However hard the government fights it, we will have these problems for this foreseeable future. And I'm also convinced that that poverty makes particular choices much harder, food choices much harder for those who are in it, and that there will need to be an unwelcome section in some ways in part 2 of the strategy, which is until we resolve the societal problems that we have with poverty, what specific food policies we need in place until we get to that point. And I'll be criticized, I'm sure, by people who will say, well, we just need to, this is taking the effort away from what really needs to happen, which is solving societal inequality. But I just think, I actually think you're going to need to have some more long-term, but still plasters to stop the food system presenting itself in such an unattractive way to those who already have been dealt the worst hand by society.
Okay, final question, because we're running out of time. What scale of intervention do you think is going to be required to end child food poverty within this Parliament, so by 2024?
Well, I would say a scale that matches the level of need which has been exposed during the period. So within this Parliament, I think we are looking at a food plan for the Parliament. I think we need to look at the whole issue about being ready to respond to the increasing number of families who are the new poor because of the pandemic, and those that are likely to come on board come on after furlough ends and the like. So I know the DWP are modelling this very strongly, but getting on the front foot with that. There needs to be a real commitment, I think, to help families get back on their feet. And some of that, of course, will be about alleviating food. And I agree with Henry in terms of both of those parts of that response is really needed. And remember, children have been out of school for so long now and are likely to have disturbed schooling for some time. So really being able to get them the support they need to be able to have the kind of routine in their lives if they're back in school, to be able to rely on free school meals within schools, but also out of school as well. So I think the pandemic won't end at the point we all have a vaccination, whenever that is. It will be building back from that. So I think there's a serious rebuild on all fronts throughout this parliament, but food poverty needs to be a central aspect of that.
Thank you. And Henry, have you got a final word?
Yeah, I mean, if you're serious about ending child food poverty in this parliament, I think that the government needs to make a fundamental separation. It needs to realise that its initiative on levelling up, its initiative to reduce inequality is absolutely the most important thing that faces our society. But it is not failure to realise that that is going to be the job of many parliaments. And I think that Marcus's very simple kind of one meal for every child if they need it, which means extending free school meals, ensuring that the healthy activity and food programs work. I actually just think it needs to say we're doing this. That's not failure, and actually put those in place such that as wealth increases, the eligibility, get the number of people who are available on that go down, but make sure that safety net is there and make sure it's strong.
Great. Okay, thank you. So that's all we have time for today. And thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to speak to us. Obviously, as a committee, we'll be considering this issue further, and we are waiting for a response from the government to the letter that we've written to clarify the government's long-term plans to end child food poverty, which is what Marcus's petition and campaign is calling for. And so we'll obviously announce as soon as we have that response, and also our next steps, which are a little dependent given the current situation in Parliament, in which we don't have a Westminster Hall debate at the moment. But as soon as we can put this to the government, we will obviously take all your evidence on board and present it to the government. So thank you so much for your time and for the very rich evidence that we've taken today. Order, order.